Hey, Shelley, how's it going?
Hey, John, how are you? I'm doing pretty well. I can't complain.
That's good, because you know what? Usually when you complain, nobody really wants to hear it anyway, right?
That is exactly true.
We you and I chatted a couple weeks ago. Here's something really cool. Earlier this year, the Fuels Institute launched the Electric Vehicle Council to kind of help people figure out what the pros and cons are of infrastructure, help them plan more constructively. When we did that, we started interacting and learning and being introduced to a whole bunch of new groups. Yours is one of them. And I am so excited that Donovan introduced us because I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. Can you share with me and help me understand a little bit more about what exactly EVHybridNoire is doing?
Sure, absolutely. So let me start off by just sharing a little bit about myself for folks who are not familiar with me or the organization. So again, my name is Shelley Francis, and I'm a former medical school professor who specializes in environmental public health, the social determinants of health, and health disparities. So my work centers around using participatory research practices, which really just simply means that I engage with communities and participants to help inform the strategies that we utilize to answer these social questions and issues. So in terms of who and what EVHybridNoire is EVHybridNoire is the largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts in the country. And so we have members and chapters all throughout the United States, as well as abroad in places such as Canada, Europe, certain countries in Africa, and in the Caribbean. And so our work focuses on accelerating EV adoption, as well as increasing awareness of EVs and clean transportation to more diverse communities. And to us, when we say diversity or diverse communities, what we say is racial and ethnic diversity, engaging rural communities, engaging young professionals, women, the LGBTQI community, refugee and immigrant communities. So really a full swath of diverse communities.
Well, I think that's so important because as we look at the electric vehicle market, we know less than 2% of sales right now are EV. 75-80% of them are Teslas. And the Model S was an extremely popular vehicle, but it wasn't necessarily the every person's car. But I think as we start building out, start selling more vehicles, clearly EVs are going to become an option for everybody across the spectrum, not just those that have the ability to buy a $100,000 Model S.
That's correct. And so one of the things that is really important to us in terms of that conversation is really letting people know that the opportunity is there to engage and to really access clean transportation from a variety of price points. So there's a lot of very affordable versions of EVs in terms of used EVs. So you can get something from $5,000 all the way on up to the very high end of that price point or spectrum, but most people don't know that those opportunities are out there. So that's one of the myths that we work to really try to dispel, is that there's an EV at every budget and every price point, and it's really for all communities, not just technology for one segment of the community.
Right, and that's even going to grow as we look at the next couple of years, and the number of models coming on the market is just going to be astounding. And you're right, there's going to be a vehicle for everybody that wants one, and that's fantastic.
Absolutely. And I do want to add too that, for the last several years, we've really been leading the conversation in the space around, the intersection of air pollution, equity, and utilizing clean transportation as a potential venue to, help alleviate that burden. And that conversation is actually even more salient now and more critical because of the trends that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic and who's impacted worst and first. And so there's really an opportunity to intentionally embrace clean transportation and make sure that we're prioritizing engaging those communities that are really impacted worst and first by overexposure to air pollution.
I think you use the term air pollution. I've been talking about that a lot this year because with the pandemic, it's a respiratory illness. And most of the focus on electrification has been carbon reduction, which is a great objective and something we need to be talking about. But there's also a little thing called criteria pollutants that actually cause air pollution, which result in respiratory distress. And so the ability to start reducing that type of air pollution, improve air quality across the board, whether we are reducing carbon emissions or not, is something we need to be really putting our arms around, saying we should be doing everything we can to clean up the air for what we're breathing every day.
Absolutely. It's so funny because we've been saying that for the last, several years. And initially, I think people were looking at us like, what are they talking about? Like we had two or three heads maybe. And so now, because of everything that's happening with the transportation sector, with the pandemic, people are like really starting to connect the dots in terms of this conversation around, hey, overexposure to air pollution, to transportation and vehicle emissions is not a good thing at all. And what we need to really be intentional in trying to accelerate our transition to electrified, multimodal transportation.
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California in the early 80s, and I remember playing out on the street, and there was this building about a mile away with a big clock on top. And some days I could see it, and some days I could not. It was just amazing. And so I've very personally approached all of this stuff as reducing emissions is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Don't focus on one thing. Reducing emissions in general is a positive thing. There seems to be a connection between what you're doing in your career prior and what you're doing now, right?
Yes, there is. Mm-hmm. So before I started this particular line of work, I was an academic researcher and professor, and I was doing a lot of research with communities around health disparities and environmental health outcomes. And so we know that the built environment in transportation particularly is one of the driving factors facilitating the overexposure to air pollution and the various respiratory illnesses that we see. Like the number one reason for most kids to be admitted to emergency rooms in most major metropolitan areas is asthma, and that's triggered by air pollution. And so when we start, to think about how we can do things differently, we know what some of these solutions are, and it's really to try to reduce vehicle emissions, and they're really very obvious ways that we can do that.
Well, let me pivot a little bit, because there's definitely, let's reduce emissions, and that's our priority. It has to be a priority for everybody. But there's also part of your mission is kind of equity. Yes. Equity of access, equity of availability. I want to ask you about the recent decision by the California governor to pass issue an executive order saying we're going to mandate nothing but zero emission vehicles by 2035. I come at this from a pragmatic perspective. How do we get from here to there? When you guys look at an order like that, what kind of questions does it raise for you in terms of implementation, objective, how it affects equity across the demographics?
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about issues around, knowledge, awareness, access, and opportunity. And so what we know is that obviously California is a very progressive market. Other states look to see what California does, and sometimes they adopt some of their, practices. Other times they run far away as they can from those practices. So we know that with California is currently the largest electric vehicle market in the United States. And as you said, it's the first state to commit to such an audacious and bold goal. According to the Wall Street Journal, that suggests that it could spark or trigger other more progressive leaning states to follow. And case in point is with Oregon's governor, Kate Brown. She has been, highly supportive, praising this order, this mandate. So I think, like we said, other states are going to watch, and they will probably adopt some of that same mandate. But in terms of trying to get to that number and accelerating adoption, there's a lot of knowledge gaps. There's knowledge gaps for people who work in the space. There's knowledge gaps for people who could benefit from the technology. So we really have to be more intentional in authentically engaging these diverse frontline communities, because you need more people to be able to accelerate and get to this 5 million EVs on the road by 2030. And in order to do that, you can't just target one segment of the community. So that's one of the ways we're working to try to really widen the tent, so to speak. So we leverage our membership base, our membership organization, and our chapters to go out into communities and show that they're people reflective of those said communities that are engaged, that are driving the technology, that are front and center in the movement, advocating for more access, more infrastructure in these communities, because there's a lot of charging deserts in Black, Latinx, and tribal communities. So if you're going to get an electric vehicle, you need a place to charge. And so if you can't charge at home, you've got to have some other options. So the really positive thing is that we're seeing a lot of movement. Just last month, Southern California Edison approved the about $436 million to build out charging infrastructure. And it's not focused just on single family. The prioritization is low to moderate income and multifamily dwelling units. So that's really going to be helpful in terms of addressing some of the gaps in charging and infrastructure.
And I think that's, again, I look at proposals like that and I don't judge whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I just ask, okay, if that's the objective, how do we get there? And the question that I have is, how are we going to make sure the grid can deliver the electricity when and where it's necessary? How are we going to build out public charging stations for the multi-unit dwellers who don't have access to a garage? What is the implication if the other zero-emission vehicle states follow suit? Now you have 12 states that are 1/3 of the vehicle population in the United States moving in this direction. What kind of pressure does that put on the economy? What kind of pressure does that put on the infrastructure? And it's all these things kind of come together. Now, we've got 15, 16 years to kind of figure some of this stuff out, but I think it's critically important that we all start asking these type of constructive questions about how do we get from here to there? Okay, you've said, 1961, 62, President Kennedy said we want to land a man on the moon. Next question is, okay, Mr. President, sounds good. How? And I think if we continue asking questions like that, hopefully we'll help the policy leaders make informed decisions so we don't end up with charging deserts or charging deserts that are populated with chargers that are completely unaffordable for the communities they're trying to serve.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I will say that I have to do a shameless plug right now. So some of the issues that you raised just now, we're in partnership with Fourth. My consulting organization, EVHybridNoire, is facilitating a thought leadership conference. So it's the National E-Mobility Equity Conference that's going to be held on November 12th and 13th. And so we're going to really try to take a deeper dive into some of those issues around how utilities can be engaged and what's the role of the philanthropy community, what's the role of community-based partners in terms of helping us accelerate electrification in a manner that's equitable and all communities have the opportunity to access the technology, and what needs to happen, to lead up to or lean into that conversation. So there's, if folks are out there and they're listening and they want to take a deeper dive, then definitely join us for that meeting. There's a free registration to participants who are representing nonprofits and community-based organizations and community members as well as nonprofits. So definitely it would be a really robust conversation, and it's a much needed conversation that we've heard across the country. So we're listening, and so that's why we're programming this conference in a couple of months. Well, actually, it's not even a couple of months anymore. I guess it's a few weeks now. Yeah, so we're definitely really excited about that and bringing in thought leaders from around the country to really share best practices and what's been proven to work.
Well, I love that approach. I love conferences that are designed to answer questions and not just push forward a position. I think that's fantastic. Well, we'll get somebody from the Fuels Institute to sit in on that. That sounds fantastic. I got a couple minutes left, but I want to ask you a question specifically about infrastructure. So I mentioned our Electric Vehicle Council is all about how do we help businesses and policymakers better understand infrastructure needs, infrastructure design, infrastructure deployment strategies. As we kind of work through this, what are some of the priorities that you would like to see included in discussions about infrastructure deployment? What things do a lot of people not pay attention to that need to be part of the conversation?
Well, yes, that's a really great question, John. So some things that really need to be part of the conversation that people don't often pay attention to is really thinking about equity and how that charging infrastructure is distributed. So when organizations are taking public money or public resources, you can't just put charging infrastructure in pockets of communities. It's public dollars, so you have to put it in, have to distribute it in a way that is accessible. So the deployment, it's very important that when you do this deployment, it's accessible. That's been a challenge, and sometimes people aren't thinking about that when they have the opportunity to start building out charging. It's really important to engage with thought leaders and communities who are going to be the beneficiaries of the technology or of the charging infrastructure. So engage with them prior to putting steel in the ground. So let people know what's coming down the pipe, develop these authentic relationships. And if your organization can't do that, then engage with subject matter experts that have a track record in doing that type of engagement and helping to facilitate that conversation. And they can be that third party or that go-between, you know, say it's the utility or the co-op and it's the community. So there definitely needs to be strengthening of community, public-private partnerships to make this happen and make this a reality. And we also have to put funding and dollars and resources behind marketing and education. So a lot of times programs are rolled out, infrastructure is built out, but only those who, like us, who are part of that ecosystem, who are part of the subject matter experts and part of the industry know that this is going on. So if we don't tell people, then they're not going to be able to use it, right? So we definitely want to make sure we're intentional in how we're marketing and how we're doing education and awareness. And please run away and stay away from the one-size-fits-all approach. That doesn't work anymore. It sounds good, but I promise you, you don't want to do it. So you really have to make sure you're tailoring your messages for your audience, because we always say messenger matters. And so you need to message in an appropriate way that your target market can embrace it and really buy and lean in.
So I'll tell you, I'm a recovering lobbyist. So I lobbied for about 15 years in Washington, D.C. And you raised a lot of things that D.C. doesn't always understand. Talk to the affected people before you do anything. That's a concept that's almost beyond comprehension in Washington. 2, think through the questions and then communicate. It really is so simple, but so foreign to so many marketing and policy operations that it seems really strange. But I love the message because it's absolutely critical. And it's something that we've been trying to push through, and everything we talk about is there are consequences for everything. There are collateral impacts that you may not be thinking about because you're focused on your channel, but you have to think beyond. You have to think about the affected consumer. And if we put the consumer first in everything we do, everything should line up and become a success at the end of the day. It's when we forget about the consumer, try to make the consumer take whatever we want to feed them, that they kind of say, yeah, you know what? I really didn't like the Betamax video player. Well, Shelley, thanks for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation. I love what you guys are doing, and I hope we can stay in touch because I really am excited about what you guys are doing out there.
John, thanks so much for having me on. It was a pleasure talking with you. And, you know, I could go on for days, you know, about education and equity and, you know, just serving all communities. So definitely appreciate the opportunity to share more of our perspective.
It was great talking to you. I'll talk to you later, Shelley. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye now.